Chapter 1. The Vanishing Files. Inspector Price sat at his desk, the weight of London's relentless crime weighing on his shoulders. It was late evening, and Price had been contemplating turning in for the night, when the sharp, urgent knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. The door swung open to reveal a breathless young constable. "Inspector Price, sir," he gasped, standing at attention. "You're needed at the British Aeronautical Office immediately. There's been a breach. Sensitive documents. Stolen." Price's mind snapped to attention. The British Aeronautical Office, the beating heart of Britain's air defence industry, was a fortress of secrecy. For someone to breach its security and steal classified documents, it was unthinkable. The repercussions of such a theft could be catastrophic, not just for Britain, but for the delicate balance of power in Europe. "Do we know what was taken?" Price asked, already reaching for his coat and hat. "Yes, sir," the constable replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "It's the plans, sir, the airship blueprints, top-secret military designs and intelligence. Lord Morley, the minister in charge, sent for you directly." Price's expression hardened. The situation was far worse than he had feared. The plans for Britain's airship fleet weren't just documents. They were the key to maintaining air superiority in the event of war. If those plans fell into the wrong hands, Britain's enemies could gain a devastating advantage. The Aeronautical Office stood like a fortress of stone and iron, its tall gates guarded by uniformed sentries who snapped to attention as Price arrived. Officials rushed through the corridors, their faces drawn with fear and confusion. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Price was immediately ushered into a grand office at the heart of the building. Waiting for him was Lord Edwin Morley, a man of impeccable posture and cold, calculating eyes. He was flanked by his trusted advisers, Henry Blackwood, the chief archivist, and Lady Evelyn Warwick, a figure well known in London's society circles, her presence lending an air of elegance to the tense room. "Inspector Price," Lord Morley greeted, "thank you for coming so quickly. We have a situation of national importance on our hands." Price inclined his head, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. The polished wood floors, the heavy curtains drawn tightly shut, the thin sheen of sweat on Blackwood's brow, and the way Lady Evelyn stood poised but tense, her hands clasped together. "Tell me what happened," he said. Lord Morley wasted no time. "Earlier this evening, we discovered that top-secret documents outlining the future of our airship fleet were stolen from a locked vault within the building. These blueprints include not only the designs of our latest airships, but also intelligence reports on foreign threats and Britain's air defence strategy. If these documents are leaked or sold to a foreign power, the consequences would be catastrophic." The level of security at the Aeronautical Office was notoriously high. For someone to have stolen such sensitive information meant they had either inside help or they were an exceptionally skilled thief. "Who had access to these documents?" Price asked. Lord Morley exchanged a quick glance with Blackwood before answering. Only a handful of individuals knew of the existence of these documents, let alone had access to them. Myself, Blackwood, Lady Evelyn, and a few other high-ranking officials. The vault itself is under constant guard, and there was no sign of forced entry. Price's gaze shifted to Blackwood. The chief archivist was a man in his late 50s, with greying hair and deep lines etched into his face. He looked pale and nervous as he stood beside Lord Morley. "I oversee the security of the vault," Blackwood said, his voice shaky but controlled. "I personally checked the vault this morning, and everything was in order. The documents were accounted for. But when I went to retrieve them later in the day, they were gone. No sign of tampering, no breach in security. It's as if they vanished into thin air." Price's eyes narrowed. "Who else had access to the vault besides you, Mr. Blackwood?" "Only a select few," Blackwood replied. "Lord Morley, of course. Lady Evelyn has clearance, though she rarely deals with the documents directly. and Colonel Jonathan Monroe, head of intelligence for the Aeronautical Office, had occasional access due to his military oversight. Price noted the names down. 4 people with direct access to the vault. Any of them could have been responsible, or someone could have manipulated one of them into doing their bidding. He turned his attention to Lady Evelyn Warwick, whose elegant demeanour belied the tension in her posture. She was a striking woman, with dark hair pinned neatly in place and a glint of sharp intelligence in her eyes. Her reputation as a close confidant of the elite made her both an asset and a potential threat in Price's mind. "And you, Lady Evelyn," Price asked, "what role do you play in this?" Lady Evelyn's expression remained composed, though her eyes flickered briefly. "I assist Lord Morley with matters of state," she replied smoothly. "I'm not directly involved with the military side of the Aeronautical Office, but I do have clearance for certain documents. As you can imagine, my position requires discretion and diplomacy." Price nodded, noting how carefully she chose her words. "And when was the last time you had access to the vault?" "Not for several weeks," Lady Evelyn replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I've had no reason to review those particular documents. In fact, I wasn't even aware they were in the vault at this time." Price studied her before turning back to Lord Morley. "And Colonel Monroe? Where is he?" Lord Morley's jaw tightened. "The Colonel is currently leading military operations on the coast. He is expected back tomorrow. Until then, you'll have to begin your investigation without him." "I'll need to inspect the vault and question all staff who had access to the building," Price said, his tone brokering no argument. "Of course," Lord Morley agreed, "but I must stress, Inspector, that this investigation must be handled with the utmost discretion. If word of this theft gets out, the repercussions could destabilize not just Britain but Europe as a whole." Price nodded gravely. He understood the gravity of the situation. "Then let's not waste any more time," Price said. "I'll begin immediately." The vault was located deep within the Aeronautical Office, a secure chamber with thick steel doors and complex locking mechanisms. Price examined the vault closely, noting the lack of forced entry. Whoever had stolen the documents either had access to the correct keys and codes or was skilled enough to bypass them without leaving a trace. The guards stationed outside the vault were questioned thoroughly, but none had seen or heard anything suspicious. The vault had been locked tight when Blackwood last checked it, and no one had entered the room without authorization. As Price stood in the quiet, echoing chamber of the vault, his thoughts returned to the suspects. Henry Blackwood, with his direct access to the vault and mounting personal debts, stood out as the most obvious candidate, but his nervousness seemed genuine. He appeared more terrified of the situation than capable of orchestrating a theft of this magnitude. Lady Evelyn Warwick had the intelligence and connections to be involved, though her calm composure suggested she hadn't been caught off guard by the theft. Colonel Monroe's absence during the theft was suspicious in its own right, and his role in military intelligence would make him a prime target for manipulation, or worse, betrayal. Price knew that to solve this case, he would need to navigate a treacherous path through politics, espionage, and personal ambition. The stolen documents were far more than just military plans. They were a key to power, and someone was willing to risk everything to obtain them. Chapter 2: The 4 Suspects. Inside the British Aeronautical Office, the air remained thick with tension. Time was of the essence, and the inspector's list of suspects narrowed to 4 key individuals, all of whom had direct access to the vault. Price arrived early at the Aeronautical Office and made his way to the small, windowless room that had been designated for his interviews. He'd requested each of the suspects be brought to him one at a time. The first to arrive was Henry Blackwood, the chief archivist, Henry Blackwood. Blackwood entered the room looking haggard, as though the events of the previous day had aged him overnight. His hands trembled slightly as he sat down across from Price. The thick folders and ledgers he normally carried with him were absent, and without them, Blackwood appeared vulnerable, exposed. Price wasted no time getting to the point. Mr. Blackwood, you oversee the security of the documents. You're the person most familiar with the vault. Walk me through everything that happened yesterday in as much detail as possible. Blackwood swallowed hard. I checked the vault in the morning, as I always do. Everything was in order. The files, the blueprints, everything was accounted for. I even double-checked the security protocols. The vault was locked, and only authorized personnel had the keys and codes. Price leaned forward slightly. Who has access to the vault, besides yourself? Lord Morley, Lady Evelyn, and Colonel Monroe, Blackwood replied. Each of them has the same level of clearance I do. And the guards outside the vault? Price pressed. What did they report? Nothing unusual, Blackwood said, his voice quivering. The guards rotate every 4 hours. No one saw anything out of the ordinary. Price took a moment to let Blackwood's words sink in. You were in charge of the documents, Mr. Blackwood. If they disappeared under your watch, how do you explain it? Blackwood's eyes widened with panic. I can't explain it. I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't take them. I would never betray my duty. My family has served the Crown for generations. I wouldn't... Price raised a hand to stop his rambling. Let's talk about your personal situation then. Financial difficulties, mounting debts. You've been struggling to keep up with your household expenses. Blackwood's face turned pale, and his hands fidgeted on his lap. I won't deny that I've had some financial troubles, but I would never sell military secrets. I've served this office for over 20 years. My loyalty isn't something that can be bought. Price noted the desperation in Blackwood's voice. He wasn't ruling the archivist out, but there was something more here, something else driving the man's anxiety. Whether he was guilty of theft or merely afraid for his position, Blackwood was clearly terrified of the consequences. I'll be checking every detail of your financial situation, Mr. Blackwood, Price said coldly. If you've been compromised in any way, I will find out. Blackwood's face flushed with a mix of shame and fear, but he said nothing as he was dismissed from the room. Lady Evelyn Warwick. Next to enter was Lady Evelyn Warwick. She walked into the room with an air of calm confidence, dressed immaculately in a tailored navy dress, her dark hair pinned back in a simple but elegant style. She offered Price a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp and watchful. Inspector Price, she greeted him. I assume you have questions for me. Price nodded and gestured for her to sit. Indeed, Lady Evelyn, you have access to the vault and its contents, though I understand you've rarely used it. How familiar are you with the documents that were stolen? Evelyn crossed her legs, settling comfortably into her chair. I knew of the documents, of course. They're of national importance, but my role at the Aeronautical Office is more political. I leave the technical details to men like Lord Morley and Colonel Monroe. Price studied her face carefully. And yet you hold the same level of clearance as those men. That suggests you have more involvement than you let on. What exactly is your connection to this project? Evelyn's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. I provide counsel to Lord Morley on various political matters. That includes anything that might affect Britain's standing in international affairs. The airship program, as you can imagine, is a cornerstone of our military strategy, and I make sure that the right alliances are formed to support it. Price leaned back slightly, folding his arms. You're close to many influential people in London, diplomats, industrialists, even foreign dignitaries. Could it be that one of them made you an offer you couldn't refuse, perhaps for access to those plans? Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed with indignation. I serve my country, Inspector. Whatever rumours you've heard about my connections, I assure you, my loyalty is to Britain. I would never sell its secrets, and I resent the implication. Price held her gaze. Loyalty can be tested, Lady Evelyn, especially when powerful people are involved. Evelyn's expression remained calm, but there was a coldness behind her eyes. If you're looking for someone who lacks loyalty, I suggest you look at Colonel Monroe. His military ambitions are well known. and he's been growing restless with his current position. Men like him who see war as a path to glory are far more dangerous than I could ever be. Price noted the deflection. Lady Evelyn was a master of social maneuvering, and while she claimed innocence, Price wasn't ready to rule her out. Her connections were vast, and she could easily have been playing a much more subtle game. "Thank you, Lady Evelyn," Price said, dismissing her. "I'll be in touch." Charles Townsend, the third suspect, Charles Townsend, strode into the room with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. Tall, well-dressed, and with a certain charm about him, Townsend's reputation as an ambitious industrialist had preceded him. He was young for someone in his position, perhaps too young in Price's mind, but his success in the aeronautical industry had earned him a seat at the table with Britain's most influential figures. "Inspector," Townsend greeted him with a practiced smile. "I hear you've been asking questions about the theft. I assume you're trying to work out who's responsible. Let me assure you, it's not me." Price didn't respond to Townsend's bravado, instead fixing him with a cold stare. "You've been working closely with the government on the airship project. Your company stands to benefit greatly from the development of new airship technologies. How much would those documents have been worth to you?" Townsend's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered. "Worth? Inspector, I don't need to steal government secrets. My company is at the forefront of innovation. Those plans would have been valuable to foreign competitors, perhaps, but I'm already involved in the project. Why jeopardize that?" "Because," Price replied, his voice low and measured, "you've been facing competition from foreign firms. Securing exclusive access to those documents could give you an edge. And if you sold them, you'd make a fortune. Money isn't a bad motivator, Mr. Townsend." Townsend leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "I don't need to steal to stay ahead, Inspector. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I don't intend to lose it all by doing something so reckless. Whoever took those documents has far more to gain by destabilizing Britain's military efforts. I have no interest in weakening my own country's defense." Price studied Townsend's face. He was slick, confident, and used to playing by his own rules. His ambition was palpable, but was it enough to push him toward espionage? "Who would benefit from the plans being stolen?" Price asked. "Who's your biggest competitor?" Townsend smiled thinly. "The French, Inspector. Their airship program has been advancing rapidly, and they've been sniffing around for any advantage they can get. If I were you, I'd be looking at who's been cozying up to foreign diplomats lately. There are plenty of people in high society who'd be willing to trade secrets for a bit of influence." Price noted the subtle jab. Yet another deflection, this time aimed at Lady Evelyn, no doubt. Townsend was skilled at pointing fingers while keeping his own hands clean, but Price wasn't ready to absolve him just yet. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend," Price said, rising from his seat. "I'll follow up on what you've said." Townsend left with a nod. Colonel Jonathan Monroe. The final suspect arrived that afternoon. Colonel Jonathan Monroe, a decorated military officer with an intimidating presence. Monroe was a man of action, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and an air of authority that filled the room. Despite his formidable reputation, Monroe appeared composed as he took his seat, his military posture never faltering. "Colonel," Price began, "you oversee intelligence operations and have had occasional access to the vault. You've been involved in Britain's airship defense strategy from the beginning. Tell me, what's your view on this theft?" Monroe's jaw clenched slightly. "It's an act of treason, plain and simple. Whoever is behind this has endangered the entire nation. Those documents contain information that could be used to undermine our defenses. If they fall into the wrong hands, the consequences would be catastrophic." Price leaned forward. "And who do you believe is responsible?" Monroe's eyes darkened. "Someone with access to the vault, obviously. Blackwood is too weak-willed to have orchestrated this, but he may have been manipulated. Townsend's ambition is dangerous, And Lady Evelyn— Monroe hesitated, his voice lowering. Lady Evelyn plays too many games with powerful men. She has connections to foreign diplomats. I wouldn't be surprised if she was involved. Price raised an eyebrow. You seem quick to shift blame, Colonel. You have access to those documents as well. How can I be sure you weren't tempted by the power or influence those plans might offer? Monroe's gaze hardened, his voice firm. Because, Inspector, my loyalty is to the Crown. I've spent my life defending this country. I would never betray it. Price studied him carefully, but Monroe's steely resolve remained unwavering. He was a man of honor, but honor could be corrupted. Was Monroe protecting his reputation, or was he hiding something deeper? I'll be watching you closely, Colonel, Price said. Make no mistake. If you had any involvement in this, I'll find out. Monroe gave a curt nod and left without another word. As the day came to a close, Inspector Price sat alone in the quiet interview room, reflecting on the 4 suspects he had questioned. Blackwood, Lady Evelyn, Townsend, and Monroe, each of them had a motive, and each of them had access to the vault. But who among them had stolen the plans? And who had the most to gain from the theft? Price's mind churned with possibilities. The stolen documents had to be found, and soon, before the delicate balance of power in Europe tipped toward disaster. Chapter 3. Hidden Agendas. The morning fog over London had returned, shrouding the city in a grey veil as Inspector Price stood by the window of his office, contemplating the tangled web of suspects he had interviewed the previous day. With a deep sigh, he turned back to the table where the files lay, scattered with notes from his interviews. He needed to dig deeper into their lives, their connections, and their motivations. Every one of them had something to hide, and he was determined to uncover what that was. Henry Blackwood, the archivist with secrets. Price began with Henry Blackwood, the chief archivist. Blackwood's nervous demeanor during their interview had raised red flags, and while he had denied any involvement in the theft, he sensed that fear had gripped the man. Blackwood had mentioned his family's financial struggles, and Price knew that money could be a powerful motivator. Price decided to pay Blackwood a visit outside of the Aeronautical Office, where the archivist might be less guarded. Blackwood lived in a modest townhouse in a quieter part of the city, far removed from the hustle of central London. When Price arrived at the door, he knocked firmly and waited. It took a few moments before Blackwood answered, and when he did, his face paled at the sight of Price. "Inspector, I wasn't expecting you," Blackwood stammered. Price entered the small cluttered parlour, noting the piles of paperwork and ledgers scattered across the room. The scent of ink and old parchment filled the air, mingling with the faint mustiness of the space. "Mr. Blackwood," Price began, taking a seat across from the archivist, "I need to ask you more about your personal affairs. You mentioned financial difficulties during our last conversation. I want to know more about that." Blackwood hesitated, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. It's true, Inspector. My family has been in some trouble. My wife fell ill some months ago, and the medical bills have been overwhelming." Price nodded, urging him to continue. "And how are you managing those bills now? Have you received any help, or offers of help?" Blackwood's face flushed with shame as he spoke. "I tried to keep up with the payments, but the debts have been mounting. I've taken out loans, but the interest is crippling. And recently, someone approached me with an offer." Price leaned forward. Blackwood swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "A foreign agent. He said he could help me clear my debts if I provided information. I didn't take the offer, Inspector. I couldn't, but I was tempted. I was desperate." Price's gaze sharpened. "So you met with this agent?" Blackwood nodded, his hands shaking. "Yes, but I never gave him anything. I swear it. I backed out at the last minute. I couldn't betray my country like that. But now I fear I've been framed." "Framed?" Price repeated. I think someone knew about my meeting with the agent, Blackwood said, his voice cracking with fear. They must have taken the documents and made it look like I was involved, but I swear, Inspector, I had nothing to do with the theft. Price sat back, processing Blackwood's confession. The man was clearly terrified, and while his financial desperation could have pushed him toward espionage, his fear seemed genuine. But if Blackwood was telling the truth about being framed, then someone else had manipulated the situation to throw suspicion on him. Who else knew about your financial troubles? Price asked. No one, Blackwood replied quickly. At least, not that I told, but someone must have known. Price stood. Stay in London, Mr. Blackwood. Don't go anywhere until I've finished my investigation. Blackwood nodded, looking relieved but still terrified. As Price left the townhouse, a new possibility began to form in his mind. If Blackwood had been framed, someone else with access to the vault had orchestrated the theft, and that person had to be one of the other suspects. Lady Evelyn Warwick, the politician's confidant. Price's next stop was Lady Evelyn Warwick's townhouse. He had left her last interview with more questions than answers. Her connections to high society and foreign diplomats made her both an asset and a potential threat. Price knew that Lady Evelyn thrived on intrigue, but her political games might have gone too far this time. When he arrived at her grand residence, a servant greeted him and escorted him to her drawing room. The room was richly decorated with velvet drapes and dark wood furniture, and the air was heavy with the scent of fresh roses. Lady Evelyn herself sat near the window, looking out onto the quiet street below, her expression thoughtful. Inspector Price, she said, turning to him with a small smile. I didn't expect you so soon. To what do I owe the pleasure? Price took a seat, his demeanor businesslike. I've been doing more digging into the theft at the Aeronautical Office, and your name keeps coming up. You have close ties with some of London's most powerful figures, politicians, diplomats, industrialists. I need to know about those ties. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her smile fading slightly. I'm well connected, Inspector. That's hardly a secret. My role as an advisor to Lord Morley requires me to keep informed about international affairs. If you're suggesting that I'm using those connections for something untoward, you'll need more than just speculation. I'm suggesting that your connections might make you a valuable target for foreign interests, Price replied, his tone sharp. Who have you been in contact with recently? Any foreign dignitaries, perhaps? Evelyn's eyes flickered. I've had conversations with diplomats, yes. That's part of my role. But I would never betray my country, Inspector. You're barking up the wrong tree. Price leaned forward, refusing to back down. I think you know more than you're letting on. You were close to Lord Morley, and you've had access to sensitive government information. Did anyone offer you something in exchange for those documents? Influence, perhaps, or leverage? Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she remained silent, as though weighing her next words carefully. Finally she spoke, her voice low and measured. There have been offers. I won't deny that. Certain foreign powers have been very interested in Britain's airship program, but I haven't taken any of those offers, Inspector. I don't play those kinds of games. Price studied her face, searching for any cracks in her composure. And what about Charles Townsend? You two have a history, don't you? Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, and a hint of annoyance crossed her face. Charles and I are acquaintances. We've crossed paths socially, but that's all. Whatever ambitions Charles has are his own. I have no interest in his schemes. Price noted the tension in her voice when she spoke of Townsend. There was something more between them, he was certain of it. But for now, Evelyn was holding her cards close to her chest. I'll be speaking with Lord Morley soon, Price said, rising to leave. If there's anything else you want to tell me before I speak to him, now's the time. Evelyn's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. I have nothing more to say, Inspector, but do keep me informed of your progress. Price nodded and left, knowing that Evelyn was far from finished with her political maneuvering. Whether she was involved in the theft or simply covering her tracks, Price wasn't convinced of her innocence just yet. Charles Townsend, the ambitious industrialist. Next, Price turned his attention to Charles Townsend, the young and ambitious industrialist with much to gain from Britain's airship program. Townsend's smooth charm and confident demeanor masked the ruthless ambition that Price had sensed in their previous meeting. If anyone had the drive to steal those documents for personal gain, it was Townsend. Price arranged to meet Townsend at his industrial estate, where the latest airship prototypes were being developed. The estate was a sprawling complex of workshops and factories, where engineers and workers buzzed about. Townsend met Price at the entrance, his smile as polished as ever. "Inspector," Townsend greeted him, extending a hand. "Come to see the future of Britain's air power?" Price shook Townsend's hand. "I'm more interested in the present, Mr. Townsend. Specifically, the stolen documents from the Aeronautical Office." Townsend's smile faltered for a split second. "Ah, yes. A terrible business that, but I assure you, I had nothing to do with it." Price followed Townsend into one of the workshops, where workers were assembling the frame of a new airship. The clanging of hammers and the hiss of steam filled the air, but Price's focus remained on Townsend. "You stand to gain a lot from those documents," Price said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Exclusive access to the plans would give your company a significant advantage over your competitors, both here and abroad." Townsend chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I don't need to steal to stay ahead, Inspector. My company is already at the forefront of innovation. Those documents wouldn't change that." "Wouldn't they?" Price asked, his tone challenging. "You've been struggling to keep up with foreign competition, particularly from the French. A well-timed sale of those documents could set you up for life. Or perhaps you're working with someone else, someone with political influence who could help you secure even bigger contracts." Townsend's eyes flickered with something cold and calculating. "I don't appreciate the implication, Inspector. My business dealings are above board. If you want to investigate someone, perhaps you should look at your other suspects, those with more political motivations. I'm a businessman, not a spy." Price didn't blink. "Your business involves a lot of powerful people, Mr. Townsend, and powerful people often play dangerous games. You're connected to Lady Evelyn Warwick, aren't you?" Townsend's jaw tightened and he forced a smile. "Lady Evelyn is an acquaintance. Nothing more." Price held his gaze for a long moment before speaking again. "I'll be watching you closely, Mr. Townsend. Don't make me regret giving you the benefit of the doubt." Townsend's smile faded completely as Price turned and left the workshop. Colonel Jonathan Monroe, the military man. Price's final stop of the day was Colonel Jonathan Monroe, the decorated military officer who oversaw intelligence operations for the Aeronautical Office. Monroe's stern demeanor and loyalty to the Crown had made him seem the least likely suspect, but Price knew that even the most loyal soldiers had their limits. Monroe had agreed to meet Price at a small military barracks on the outskirts of the city. The colonel greeted him with a firm handshake and led him into his private office, a no-nonsense space adorned with maps and military documents. "Inspector," Monroe began, taking a seat behind his desk, "I assume you've made progress in your investigation." Price sat across from him. "I have, Colonel, but I still have questions about your involvement." Monroe's expression didn't waver. "I've already told you, I had nothing to do with the theft. My loyalty to Britain is absolute." "Absolute loyalty can be tested," Price replied evenly, "especially when political ambitions are involved. You're in a position of power, Colonel. Those documents could have been used to leverage even more influence within the military. Or perhaps you've uncovered something more, something you don't want revealed." Monroe's eyes narrowed, his voice growing cold. "I serve the Crown, Inspector. I have no need for political games. My only concern is protecting Britain's interests. Price nodded slowly. Monroe was a man of duty, but duty could sometimes blind a person to the consequences of their actions. If Monroe had discovered a deeper conspiracy within the military or the government, he might have taken drastic steps to cover it up. "I'll need to review your records, Colonel," Price said, standing to leave. "I hope you won't mind." Monroe's jaw clenched, but he gave a curt nod. "Do as you must, Inspector. I have nothing to hide." The day had been long and grueling, but as Price returned to his office that evening, he felt a growing sense of clarity. He knew one thing for certain: the theft was not just about personal gain. There was a larger game being played here, one that involved politics, military power, and international intrigue. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Price realized that he was getting closer to the truth. The question was, would he uncover it before another move was made? Chapter 4. A Break in the Case. It was just past dawn when Inspector Price received an urgent knock on his office door. The constable who entered was out of breath, his face flushed with urgency. Price's eyes snapped to the young man, instantly alert. "Inspector, you need to come to the docks immediately. There's been a memo just now. A man matching Henry Blackwood's description will be meeting with a known foreign agent this early morning." Blackwood, the anxious chief archivist, had mentioned his meeting with a foreign agent, but he'd sworn it was innocent. Nothing had changed hands, he claimed. Grabbing his coat and hat, Price followed the constable into the chilly London morning. The docks, a labyrinth of warehouses and shipyards, were alive with the early stirrings of workers loading and unloading goods. Price could see the steam rising from the ships, the thick ropes creaking under the weight of crates as they were hoisted onto the decks. But his focus was on a particular warehouse near the edge of the docks, where the meeting had allegedly taken place. Price motioned for his men to follow him as he approached the building. His senses heightened. The air smelled of salt water and coal smoke, and the distant cries of gulls echoed through the mist. Inside the warehouse, the scene was eerily quiet. Crates were stacked high, casting long shadows in the dim light. "Spread out and search the area," Price ordered his constables. "We're looking for any sign of a meeting, if it has already taken place." The constables fanned out, their boots clattering against the wooden floor as they began their search. Price moved cautiously toward the far corner of the warehouse, where the shadows were thickest. His eyes caught a glint of something metallic, perhaps a small weapon or coin, and he knelt down to examine it more closely. As he did, a faint sound reached his ears. The door creaked open behind him. To his surprise, Henry Blackwood stepped into the warehouse, his face pale and drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. The archivist froze when he saw Price, his eyes widening in terror. "Inspector," Blackwood stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" Price stood slowly. "I could ask you the same question, Mr. Blackwood. What are you doing at the docks, meeting with a foreign agent?" Blackwood's face went white. I didn't. I mean, I came here to meet someone, but it's not what you think." "Isn't it?" Price stepped closer, his voice cold. "You've been caught at the scene, Blackwood. You told me about your financial difficulties, about the foreign agent's offer. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, but now you're here again, in a suspicious location, at a suspicious time. What am I supposed to think?" Blackwood's lip trembled, and for a moment, "Please, Inspector, you have to believe me. I didn't sell the documents. I didn't even take them. But I know who did." Price raised an eyebrow. "You're saying someone else stole the documents and framed you?" Blackwood nodded fervently, his voice rising with panic. "Yes, I met with the foreign agent before. Yes, but I didn't follow through. Someone must have found out about that meeting and used it to throw suspicion on me. I was drawn here today, lured into a trap. They're trying to set me up." Price crossed his arms, still skeptical. "And who exactly is they, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood hesitated, glancing around. It's not just one person. There's a conspiracy, a group of people with influence, people who want to use the documents for their own gain, to sell them to the highest bidder. Price's eyes narrowed. Names, Blackwood? I need names. The archivist swallowed hard. I don't know all of them, but Lady Evelyn Warwick. I've seen her meeting with people who don't belong in those circles. Foreigners, diplomats. She's been involved in something for months now, something bigger than just those documents. And who else? Blackwood licked his lips. Charles Townsend. He's not the mastermind, but he's involved. He's been using his connections to broker deals, to position himself as the supplier of new airship technology. The documents would have given him an advantage over his competitors. And Colonel Monroe? Price asked. Where does he fit into all this? Blackwood hesitated again, his fear more pronounced. Monroe knows about the conspiracy, but he's not involved. He's been investigating it himself, trying to uncover the players. That's why he's a target too. Price's thoughts flashed back to the attempted poisoning of Colonel Monroe. The colonel had been close to exposing the truth, and someone had tried to silence him before he could reveal it. Before Price could question Blackwood further, there was a loud crash from outside the warehouse. Price's instincts flared, and he quickly motioned for Blackwood to stay down. His constables rushed to the entrance, and Price followed. Outside, the fog had thickened again, swirling in ghostly wisps as the sounds of scuffling echoed through the streets. Two figures were running toward the docks, disappearing into the mist before Price could get a clear view. After them, Price shouted to his men. Do not let them escape. Price turned back to Blackwood, who was still cowering in the corner of the warehouse. You're coming with me, Price said, his voice steely. You'll be under protection until I can confirm what you've told me. Blackwood nodded weakly, his face pale with fear. Thank you, Inspector. Please, you have to stop them before it's too late. Price guided Blackwood out of the warehouse and into the waiting transport. Lady Evelyn's intrigue. Back at the Aeronautical Office, Price wasted no time. Blackwood's confession had painted a picture of a conspiracy that stretched beyond the confines of the Aeronautical Office itself. And if Lady Evelyn Warwick was truly at the centre of it, she was far more dangerous than Price had initially believed. He sent word to Lady Evelyn's townhouse, requesting an immediate meeting. This time, he wasn't going to be swayed by her charm or elegance. He would get the answers he needed one way or another. When Price arrived at Lady Evelyn's residence, the servant ushered him in with a hint of nervousness. It was clear that news of the investigation had begun to spread. Lady Evelyn greeted him in the drawing room, her smile as poised as ever, but Price could sense the underlying unease. Inspector Price, she said, her voice smooth. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Has there been a development in the case? Price remained standing, his eyes cold as he faced her. I've had a conversation with Henry Blackwood. He's told me quite a bit about your recent activities, Lady Evelyn. Activities that involve meetings with foreign diplomats and a conspiracy to steal the documents from the Aeronautical Office. For the briefest of moments, Lady Evelyn's mask slipped. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, and Price could see the calculation behind them, the wheels turning as she decided how to respond. But she recovered quickly, her smile returning, though it no longer reached her eyes. Inspector, she said, her voice low and measured, I don't know what Blackwood has told you, but I assure you it's a lie. The man is desperate, grasping at straws to save himself. Price didn't move, his gaze unwavering. He mentioned Charles Townsend as well. Your acquaintance. He's been brokering deals, using the stolen documents to position himself for power. Lady Evelyn's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing as she took a step closer to Price. Charles is a businessman, Inspector. Ambitious, yes, but he wouldn't risk treason. And as for me, whatever meetings Blackwood claims to have witnessed, they were purely diplomatic. Nothing more. Price watched her carefully. I think you've been playing a dangerous game, Lady Evelyn, and it's about to catch up with you. I'll be speaking with Townsend soon. If you want to save yourself, now's the time to tell me the truth. For a long moment, Lady Evelyn said nothing. The tension in the room was thick, and Price could see the conflict in her eyes. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Fine, Inspector," she said quietly, "but you won't like what you hear." Chapter 5. The Deadly Trap. The air in Lady Evelyn Warwick's drawing room was thick with tension, and Inspector Price watched her carefully. As she settled into her seat, the cracks were beginning to show. "I'll tell you what I can, Inspector," Lady Evelyn began, "but you must understand. I've been navigating treacherous waters for months. The people involved in this conspiracy are powerful, dangerous. If I've been playing a dangerous game, as you put it, it's only because I've been forced to. I've had to protect myself." Price remained silent, giving her the space to continue. Lady Evelyn exhaled slowly, as if gathering her thoughts. "Charles Townsend, yes, I know him well, and he has been ambitious, shall we say. But it's not just ambition that drives him. There are foreign interests at play here. Townsend has been brokering deals with a French consortium, powerful industrialists, men with ties to the French government. They're eager to catch up to Britain's advances in airship technology, and Townsend saw an opportunity to sell them access to the plans." Price's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. The French had been Britain's chief rivals in the race for military dominance in the skies. "Go on," Price urged, his voice low. "What role do you play in this? How are you involved?" Lady Evelyn's eyes darkened, and for the first time she looked vulnerable. "I've been meeting with foreign diplomats, yes, but it wasn't to sell Britain's secrets. I was gathering intelligence. I've been working with Lord Morley to understand who our true enemies are, both abroad and within our own government." Price's brow furrowed. "So you're claiming to be innocent, that you were working under cover for the government?" Lady Evelyn's lips twisted into a faint smile, though it held no warmth. "Innocent? Hardly. I'm no saint, Inspector. I've had to manipulate, deceive, and make deals with men who would gladly see me destroyed. But I haven't sold out my country. I've been trying to stop Townsend, and others like him, before they hand over Britain's future to the highest bidder." Price crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "You expect me to believe that you were working against Townsend this whole time? That everything you've done has been for the good of the nation?" "I expect you to believe what you see fit, Inspector," Lady Evelyn replied, her tone cold. "But Townsend is dangerous, and he isn't working alone. There's more at stake here than just military plans." Price's eyes narrowed. "What else is at stake?" Lady Evelyn hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It's not just about the airship blueprints. Townsend's consortium has been buying influence within Britain. They've been bribing officials, funding key political figures, all to ensure that when the time comes, they'll have the leverage they need to control the future of Britain's military industry. And I suspect that they're not alone. There are others, people in high places, who are willing to sell out Britain's interests for the right price." Price's pulse quickened. The conspiracy was deeper and darker than he had anticipated. If what Lady Evelyn said was true, this was no longer just about stolen documents. This was about the control of Britain's future, its military, and its government. "Who are these others you suspect?" Price asked, his voice hardening. Lady Evelyn's expression grew grim. "Lord Morley has been investigating, but he's keeping his findings close to his chest. He's worried about a mole, someone close to him, maybe even within his own office. That's why he's been so careful." Price felt a surge of frustration. "You're saying there's a traitor within the British Aeronautical Office itself?" Lady Evelyn nodded. "It's possible. Townsend has allies, people who've been working in the shadows, facilitating deals, covering his tracks. If you want to stop this, Inspector, you'll have to find out who's helping him from the inside." Price rose from his chair, his mind already racing with possibilities. If there was a mole within the Aeronautical Office, someone who had been assisting Townsend, then the theft of the documents was only the beginning. The real danger lay in the conspiracy that could unravel the very fabric of Britain's government and military. I'll speak with Lord Morley, Price said, his tone sharp. And if I find out you've been lying to me, Lady Evelyn, I'll make sure you answer for it. Lady Evelyn's smile returned, but this time it was full of weariness. Do what you must, Inspector, but be careful. The people you're up against, they won't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. Price nodded curtly and turned to leave. He now had confirmation of Townsend's involvement and a possible mole within the Aeronautical Office. But the stakes had risen to a new level. The conspiracy wasn't just about selling secrets, it was about controlling Britain's future. The poisoning of Colonel Monroe. On his way back to the Aeronautical Office, Price's thoughts shifted to Colonel Jonathan Monroe. Monroe had likely uncovered something dangerous, something that had put him directly in the crosshairs of Townsend and his allies. Price arrived at the military hospital, where Monroe had been recovering since the poisoning. The colonel had survived, but his condition had been touch and go for days. Price entered the sterile, quiet room and found Monroe propped up in bed, looking far more frail than the stern military man Price had questioned earlier in the investigation. Monroe's eyes narrowed as Price approached. "Inspector," he greeted, his voice weak but steady. "I wasn't expecting a visit." Price sat down beside the colonel's bed. "Colonel, I need answers. You've been investigating the theft of the documents, haven't you? And you got too close. That's why someone tried to poison you." Monroe's lips tightened into a grim line. "You've figured that much out, have you?" "Yes, I've been digging into this mess for months. I suspected something was wrong long before the theft. I didn't know exactly who was involved, but I knew Townsend had connections to foreign powers. And I had reason to believe someone inside the Aeronautical Office was helping him." Price leaned forward. "Who? Do you know who the mole is?" Monroe's eyes flickered with frustration. "I don't have concrete proof yet, but I've been narrowing it down. The theft couldn't have happened without someone on the inside, someone with access to the vault and knowledge of the security protocols. My suspicion is that it's someone close to Lord Morley." Price thought, could the mole be one of Lord Morley's trusted advisers, someone in his inner circle? He thought of Henry Blackwood, Lady Evelyn, and the possibility of another figure working behind the scenes. "Blackwood mentioned a foreign agent," Price said. "He met with one, but he swears he didn't hand over the documents. Could the mole have framed him?" Monroe nodded slowly. "It's possible. Blackwood's too weak to pull off something like this on his own. He might have been manipulated, used as a pawn. But Townsend is the key. He's orchestrating this. He's the one brokering deals with the French, and he's the one we need to stop." Price felt a surge of determination. Monroe was right. Townsend was the linchpin in this conspiracy. But Price couldn't afford to make a move until he knew exactly who else was involved. "I need you to stay safe, Colonel," Price said, rising from his seat. "Whoever tried to kill you will try again if they think you're about to expose them." Monroe nodded, though his expression remained grim. "I'm not afraid to die for my country, Inspector, but I won't go down without a fight." Charles Townsend's estate. With Monroe's words still ringing in his ears, Price made his way to Charles Townsend's industrial estate. The estate was a sprawling complex of workshops, airship prototypes, and towering warehouses. Price was met at the entrance by one of Townsend's assistants, who led him to the industrialist's private office. Townsend greeted Price with his usual charm, though there was a hint of wariness in his eyes. "Inspector Price," Townsend said, offering a tight smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Price didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've spoken with Lady Evelyn. She's told me everything, about your deals with the French, about the stolen documents, and about the conspiracy you're involved in." Townsend's smile faltered, and for the first time, Price saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. "Lady Evelyn is mistaken," Townsend said, his voice growing cold. "I'm a businessman, Inspector. Nothing more." Price took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're more than that, Townsend. You've been selling out your country to the highest bidder, and you've been using Blackwood to cover your tracks. But now it's over. I have enough to arrest you, and when I do, your entire operation will come crashing down." Townsend's eyes darkened, and for a moment, he seemed to consider his options. Then, with a sudden movement, he stepped back toward his desk, his hand reaching for something hidden behind it. Before Townsend could react, Price was on him, grabbing his wrist and slamming it down onto the desk. A small revolver clattered to the floor as Townsend let out a cry of pain. "You'll regret this, Inspector," Townsend hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Price cuffed Townsend's hands behind his back, his grip firm. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and so will the courts." As Price led Townsend out of the office, his mind raced. Townsend was caught, but the conspiracy was far from over. There were still others involved, and the mole within the Aeronautical Office was still at large. But for now, Price had taken down one of the key players. Chapter 6: A Web of Deception. As Inspector Price walked out of Charles Townsend's industrial estate with his suspect in custody, he knew all too well that this conspiracy ran far deeper than one man. Townsend was the tip of the spear, sharp, dangerous, but not the one wielding it. The next step was clear: uncover the mole within the British Aeronautical Office. Lady Evelyn Warwick had hinted at high-level betrayal, and Colonel Monroe had confirmed the likelihood of an insider. Upon arriving at Scotland Yard, Price ordered Townsend to be placed in an isolated cell under heavy guard. As the cell door clanged shut, Townsend finally broke his silence. "You think you've won, Inspector?" he sneered, his voice venomous. "You have no idea what you're up against. I'm not the mastermind. You're still chasing shadows. There's more at play here than you could possibly imagine." Price stared at him coldly. "Then tell me, who's pulling the strings?" Townsend's eyes glinted with something dark. "If I told you they'd kill us both before dawn, I'd rather take my chances with the gallows." Price's patience thinned. "You'll hang either way, Townsend, but if you cooperate, perhaps I can convince the courts to show leniency." Townsend laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Cooperate? You don't get it, do you, Inspector? This isn't just about money or influence. It's about control. Control over the future of Britain's military, its government. They won't stop at anything to keep their grip on power. You think you've caught me, but I'm just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone far more dangerous still out there, and when they come for you, you won't see it coming." With a final cold glance at Townsend, Price turned and left the cell. Someone in the British Aeronautical Office was working with Townsend, and they were still at large. That meant the investigation wasn't over. It had only just begun. A suspicious encounter. As Price made his way back to his office, his mind churned with possibilities. He needed to confront Lord Edwin Morley, the man who had called for this investigation in the first place. He sent word ahead to Lord Morley, requesting an urgent meeting at his private residence. The ride to Morley's mansion took Price through the quiet, fog-draped streets of London. As he approached the grand house, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He was on the verge of something big, something that could either expose the full extent of the conspiracy or lead him into an even deadlier trap. When he arrived, Lord Morley greeted him in his study, a grand room lined with bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains. The fire crackled away. Morley offered Price a drink, but the inspector waved it away. "Inspector Price," Morley began, "what brings you here at this late hour? Have you made progress?" Price met his gaze directly. "I've arrested Charles Townsend. He's been selling the stolen airship blueprints to foreign powers, specifically to a French consortium." Morley's expression darkened, his brow furrowing deeply. "Townsend, I knew the man had ambition, but I never imagined he would go so far as treason. And the documents, are they recovered?" "Not yet," Price replied, his voice tense. "Townsend wasn't acting alone. I believe there's a mole inside the Aeronautical Office, someone who's been feeding Townsend information." Morley's eyes widened with shock, but there was something in his reaction that unsettled Price. It was too clean, too perfect. "A mole? Inside my office? That's unthinkable. I'm afraid it's very real, Lord Morley, Price said, and I need to know who has access to the security protocols, who has the power to manipulate the system without drawing attention. Morley hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the fire. The only people with that level of access are my most trusted advisors, Henry Blackwood, of course, though he's been under suspicion for some time now. Lady Evelyn Warwick has clearance, as does Colonel Monroe. Price leaned forward slightly, watching Morley closely. What about you, Lord Morley? Could anyone in your inner circle have betrayed you? Morley's face stiffened. Inspector, I assure you, my loyalty to the Crown is absolute. I have no reason to betray my country. Price studied Morley's face, looking for any sign of deception. But Morley was a practiced politician. If he was hiding something, he wouldn't make it easy to detect. Before Price could press further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A servant entered the study, his face pale with worry. Lord Morley, the servant said breathlessly, there's been an incident at the Aeronautical Office. Colonel Monroe, he's been found unconscious in his office. They think it's another poisoning attempt. Price's heart skipped a beat. Monroe had been attacked once before, and now it seemed the conspirators were trying to silence him for good. If Monroe died, the trail of clues might die with him. I need to get to the Aeronautical Office immediately, Price said, rising to his feet. Morley stood as well. I'll come with you, Inspector. We need to put an end to this madness. The poisoned colonel. The journey to the Aeronautical Office was tense. Colonel Jonathan Monroe had been a target from the beginning, and now the conspirators were making another attempt on his life. Monroe had uncovered something that made him a threat to the people pulling the strings. When they arrived at the office, Price was greeted by the sight of a somber crowd of officials and guards gathered near Monroe's office. A doctor was tending to the colonel, who lay unconscious on a couch, his skin pale. Price approached the doctor, his voice urgent. Will he survive? The doctor glanced up, his face grim. He's been poisoned, but this time the dose wasn't fatal. He's unconscious, but he'll live. He was lucky, Inspector. Price exhaled, relief mixing with frustration. Monroe's survival was a blessing, but he was still unconscious, unable to provide the answers desperately needed. Price turned to the gathered officials, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of the mole. Morley stood nearby, his face ashen with concern, but there was something about his posture, something guarded, calculating. Could Morley be the one behind the conspiracy, or was he merely a pawn in a larger game? Just then, Henry Blackwood appeared at the entrance to the office, his face flushed with worry. Inspector Price, I heard what happened to the colonel. Will he survive? Price nodded slowly. He'll live, but someone's trying very hard to make sure he doesn't. Blackwood's hands trembled. This is madness. Whoever is behind this, they're willing to kill anyone who stands in their way. Price watched him closely. Blackwood's fear seemed genuine, but in this case, appearances meant little. I need to know where you were tonight, Blackwood, Price said. Blackwood stammered. I was at home, Inspector. My wife can vouch for me. I've had no part in this, I swear. Blackwood, Monroe, Lady Evelyn, Morley, every one of them had secrets, and every one of them was connected to the stolen documents. But now, with Monroe unconscious and Townsend in custody, the window of opportunity was closing fast. The trap is set. As the night wore on, Price made a decision. The mole within the British Aeronautical Office had shown their hand by attempting to kill Monroe again, and now they were desperate. Price needed to flush them out before they could disappear into the shadows once more. He gathered his team of constables and devised a plan. They would spread word that Colonel Monroe had regained consciousness and was ready to give a statement. The mole would have no choice but to act, knowing that Monroe could expose the entire conspiracy. Price returned to Lord Morley's office, where the man still stood by the fire. I have a plan to expose the mole, Price said. "We'll spread a rumor that Colonel Monroe has regained consciousness. The mole will believe he's about to talk, and they'll try to make one last move." Morley's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "And if this doesn't work?" Price's gaze hardened. "Then we'll have to hope Monroe wakes up before it's too late." Morley nodded, his expression grim. "Do what you must, Inspector. I'll support you." As Price left the office, the wheels of his plan were already in motion. Chapter 7. The Mole Revealed. The dim light of dawn was just beginning to creep through. Inspector Price sat at his desk, staring at the crumpled map of the British Aeronautical Office laid out before him. Price had sent word through his constables. Colonel Jonathan Monroe was recovering and ready to speak. But in truth, Monroe was still unconscious, lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable and silent. The trap was set, and now it was only a matter of time before the mole, desperate to protect their role in the conspiracy, made a move. Price had his constables stationed throughout the Aeronautical Office, poised to act at the first sign of trouble. They were waiting, just as Price was, for the traitor to reveal themselves. Charles Townsend was in custody, and while the industrialist had been a key player, Townsend himself had made it clear that someone more powerful was pulling the strings. Lady Evelyn Warwick had provided critical information, but her involvement remained suspect. And then there was Lord Morley, whose every reaction felt too practiced, too composed. Price still wasn't sure whether Morley was an unwitting victim or the mastermind behind it all. The knock at the door came just after dawn. Constable Harris, one of Price's most trusted men, entered the office with a grim expression on his face. "It's time, sir," Harris said, his voice quiet. "There's been movement at the Aeronautical Office." Price rose quickly, grabbing his coat and hat. "Who's made the move?" "It's Henry Blackwood, sir. He's at the office now, and he's headed toward Colonel Monroe's room." Price's eyes narrowed. Henry Blackwood, the nervous chief archivist who had claimed to be framed. Blackwood had been a suspect from the beginning, but his fear and desperation had seemed genuine. Could he have been the mole all along, using his position of trust to cover his tracks? "Get a team to follow him," Price ordered. "Don't let him out of your sight." Harris nodded and quickly left the room, leaving Price with his thoughts. If Blackwood was truly the mole, then he had played his part masterfully, pretending to be a victim, all the while orchestrating the theft of the airship blueprints. But Price wasn't convinced yet. He needed to see this play out. A deadly confrontation. Price made his way through the building with purpose, his footsteps echoing down the marble halls as he approached Colonel Monroe's office. The air was thick with tension as Price arrived at the entrance to Monroe's room. The door was slightly ajar, and Price motioned for his men to stay back as he carefully pushed it open. Inside, he saw Henry Blackwood standing by Monroe's bedside, his face pale and his hands trembling. In one hand, Blackwood held a vial, a small glass container filled with a clear liquid. Poison. "Step away, Blackwood," Price said, his voice calm but firm. Blackwood jumped, nearly dropping the vial as he turned to face Price, his eyes wide with fear. "Inspector, I wasn't going to hurt him. I needed to make sure he couldn't talk. Please, you have to understand." Price stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. "Understand what, Blackwood? That you've been working with Townsend this entire time? That you're the one who stole the documents?" Blackwood shook his head frantically, his voice trembling. "No, I didn't steal the documents, I swear it. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was forced into it, Inspector. They threatened my family." Price's eyes narrowed. "Who threatened you? Who's behind all of this?" Blackwood hesitated. It's not just Townsend. He was just a piece of it. The real mastermind is... Before Blackwood could finish, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the hallway. Price turned just in time to see Lord Edwin Morley appear in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. He strode into the room, his eyes fixed on Blackwood. Blackwood, Morley barked, his voice cold and authoritative. What do you think you're doing here? Price stepped between Morley and Blackwood, his hand resting on the cane at his side. Hold on, Lord Morley. Blackwood was about to tell me who's really behind this conspiracy. I suggest you let him finish. Morley's eyes flicked between Price and Blackwood, his jaw tightening. Inspector, I've known Henry Blackwood for years. He's a weak man, easily manipulated. Whatever he's told you is nothing more than the ramblings of a desperate man trying to save himself. Price felt a surge of suspicion. Morley's reaction was too aggressive, too controlled. And what about you, Lord Morley? You've been at the center of this investigation from the start. Could it be that you've been pulling the strings this entire time? Morley's eyes blazed with fury. It's true, Blackwood shouted. Morley's been behind it all. He's the one who orchestrated the theft. He used me, used Townsend, to cover his tracks. I was just following orders. Price turned to face Morley, his suspicions confirmed. Is that true, Lord Morley? For a moment, Morley stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the anger drained from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating smile. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Inspector, Morley said quietly. But I'm afraid you've come too far now. You see, I've spent years building this network, securing the future of Britain's military. The government is weak, riddled with indecision. I've taken it upon myself to ensure that we have the power we need to control our destiny. Price's grip tightened on his cane. And you think selling military secrets to foreign powers is the way to secure that future? Morley's smile widened. Not just selling, Inspector. Controlling. The French may believe they're gaining something valuable, but I've been playing both sides. With the airship blueprints in their hands, I can manipulate their moves, ensuring that Britain stays one step ahead. It's a delicate game, but one that will ensure our dominance in Europe. You're a traitor, Morley, Price said. Morley's eyes glinted with cold amusement. Traitor? No, Inspector. I'm a patriot. I've done what needed to be done, what the Crown was too afraid to do. Price stepped forward. It's over, Morley. You'll answer for your crimes. But Morley wasn't finished. His hand slipped into his coat, and in a flash, he drew a small pistol, leveling it at Price. Perhaps not, Inspector, Morley said softly, his eyes locked onto Price's. You should have stayed out of this. Price's eyes flicked to the gun, but before Morley could pull the trigger, a sudden movement from the corner of the room caught Price's attention. Henry Blackwood lunged forward, his hand knocking the pistol from Morley's grip just as the shot rang out. Morley staggered back, stunned, as Blackwood wrestled the gun from his hand. Price reacted swiftly, grabbing Morley by the collar and cuffing him. It's over, Morley, Price said. You've lost. Morley slumped against the wall, his face pale and drained of its earlier arrogance. You'll never stop them all, he whispered, his voice hollow. There are others, in every corner of the government. You've only scratched the surface. Price stared at him for a long moment. The conspiracy was larger than he had imagined, but for now, he had taken down one of its most dangerous players. The aftermath. As the dust settled, Price turned to Henry Blackwood, who stood trembling in the corner of the room, still clutching the vial of poison. The archivist looked broken, his face etched with guilt and fear. I'm sorry, Inspector, Blackwood stammered. I never wanted any of this. Morley, he threatened my family. I had no choice. Price's expression softened slightly. You did the right thing in the end, Blackwood, but you'll still have to answer for your part in this. Blackwood nodded weakly, tears welling in his eyes. I understand. As Blackwood was led away by the constables, Price turned his attention back to Lord Morley. The former minister's head was bowed, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing more than a broken man. But Morley's final words echoed in Price's mind. You've only scratched the surface. The conspiracy had been far-reaching, and while Morley had been one of the key players, there were others still at large, others who would continue their treachery if left unchecked. Price knew his work was far from finished. Chapter 8: Unraveling the Web. It had been days since Lord Edwin Morley's arrest. The weight of Morley's final words still lingered in Price's mind. "You've only scratched the surface." Price had been poring over every piece of evidence they had collected, documents, confessions, and interviews, and had come to one unavoidable conclusion. This conspiracy was bigger than anyone had anticipated. Morley had been at the center of it, but as Price had feared, there were others still lurking in the shadows, manipulating events for their own gain. A knock at the door brought him out of his thoughts. Constable Harris entered. "Inspector," Harris began, "we've intercepted a message. It seems that one of Morley's closest associates, a man by the name of Sir James Bellingham, is preparing to flee the country. He's booked passage on a ship leaving for France tonight." Price's eyes narrowed. Sir James Bellingham, a high-ranking official in the Admiralty, had long been suspected of harbouring connections to foreign powers, but nothing had ever been proven. If Bellingham was involved in Morley's scheme, it would explain why the conspiracy had spread so easily through the military ranks. Bellingham had both the influence and the resources to keep the conspiracy alive. "I want a team at the docks," Price said, his voice firm. "If Bellingham's trying to run, we need to stop him before he leaves British soil." Harris nodded and left the room. If Price could capture Bellingham, he could bring down the last of Morley's network. But if Bellingham escaped, the conspiracy would continue, with or without its mastermind. A race against time. By the time Price and his constables arrived at the docks, the sky had darkened, and the rain had become a steady downpour. The ship Sir James Bellingham had booked passage on, a grand vessel bound for France, loomed in the distance, its sails already being unfurled in preparation for departure. Price scanned the crowded docks. The area was bustling with activity, sailors shouting orders as crates were loaded onto the ship, passengers hurrying to board, and port officials overseeing the chaos. But there was no sign of the man Price was hunting. "Harris," Price called, his voice barely audible over the din. "Spread the men out. Check the taverns, the alleys, anywhere he might be hiding. We can't let him slip through our fingers." The constables fanned out, their eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. As Price reached the edge of the pier, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance, a tall man in a dark cloak, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "That's him," Price muttered to himself, quickening his pace. He followed the figure. The man glanced over his shoulder once, and Price caught a glimpse of his face, sharp features, greying hair, and eyes that darted nervously, as if expecting to be followed. It was Sir James Bellingham. Price could feel the tension building as Bellingham moved closer to the ship, his steps growing faster with each passing second. "Bellingham," Price called, his voice cutting through the rain. The man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. For a split second, their eyes locked, and Price saw the flash of recognition and fear in Bellingham's gaze. Without warning, Bellingham turned and bolted toward the ship. "Stop him!" Price shouted to the nearby constables, but Bellingham was fast, dodging through the crowd with desperate speed. Price sprinted after him, his boots slipping on the rain-slicked cobblestones, but he didn't slow down. Bellingham was nearly at the boarding ramp when one of Price's constables lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled briefly, but Bellingham was no match for the constable's strength. Panting and soaked through, Price caught up with them just as Bellingham was dragged to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "You're not going anywhere, Bellingham," Price said coldly, stepping closer. "You're under arrest for conspiracy and treason against the Crown." Bellingham's eyes blazed with defiance. "You don't understand, Inspector. What I've done, what we've done, was necessary. Morley knew that. You and your lot, you're too blind to see the truth." Price's jaw clenched. "The only truth is that you've betrayed your country, and now you'll answer for it." The confession. Back at Scotland Yard, Sir James Bellingham sat in an interrogation room. his hand shackled to the table in front of him. Price stood across from him, watching as the once powerful man stared blankly at the floor. "You're finished, Bellingham," Price said. "Charles Townsend, Henry Blackwood, and now Lord Morley. They've all either confessed or been caught red-handed. The conspiracy is over, but you still have a chance to save yourself." Bellingham raised his head slowly, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a strange mixture of anger and resignation. "You think this is over, Inspector? You think capturing me will stop what's coming?" Price's expression didn't change. "I think stopping you will prevent more lives from being ruined. Now, start talking." For a long moment, Bellingham said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. "It started with Morley," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "He was the one who first approached me, years ago, before the airship blueprints were even drawn up. He saw the future, saw what was coming. He knew that Britain's military would either lead the world or be left behind, and he wasn't willing to leave it to chance. Morley believed that the government was too weak, too indecisive to make the hard choices," Bellingham continued. "He saw the airship program as the key to securing Britain's dominance, but he also saw an opportunity. He started making deals, first with British industrialists like Townsend, then with foreign powers. The idea was simple: sell just enough of the airship technology to keep the French interested, but hold back the real advancements for ourselves. We'd keep them chasing our shadow while we solidified our own military supremacy." Price felt a surge of anger. "So you were willing to play both sides, just to ensure Britain came out on top?" Bellingham's eyes met Price's, unflinching. "We weren't just playing, Inspector. We were controlling. With the power of the airship fleet, we could influence everything: trade, politics, war. Morley had connections in every corner of Europe, and with Townsend's help, we were positioning ourselves to become the real power behind the government." "And what about the poisonings?" Price asked, his voice sharp. "You tried to kill Colonel Monroe. He knew too much, didn't he?" Bellingham's jaw tightened. "Monroe was a loose end. He'd started asking too many questions, and Morley knew he had to be silenced. The first attempt failed, and we couldn't risk another." "And the others?" Price pressed. "Who else was involved? You mentioned that we'd only scratched the surface." Bellingham hesitated, then shook his head. "It doesn't matter, Inspector. You've cut off the head, but the body will keep moving." Price's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." A new beginning. As the hours passed and Bellingham's full confession was recorded, Price felt both a sense of victory and a gnawing uncertainty. The conspiracy that had threatened Britain's military had been exposed, and its key players, Morley, Townsend, Blackwood, and Bellingham, were either in custody or dead. But the fight wasn't over. Bellingham's words echoed in Price's mind. "You can't stop them all." As he looked out the window at the rain-soaked streets of London, Price knew that his work would continue. There were more questions to answer, more people to bring to justice. But for now, he had won a hard-fought battle. The airship plans were safe, and Britain's future was once again in the hands of those who had sworn to protect it.